From game day to signing day, breaking down every snap and all the news on Alabama's top football recruits. It's time for Crimson and Blue Chips with your host, John Garcia Jr.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome in to a fresh and free edition of Crimson and Blue Chips. It is Wednesday, and obviously we are on the road. Don't got the office in the background. Football season is here, so we are out and about in the great state of Alabama checking out some of the top high school talent. But today, much about the Alabama Crimson Tide's current football team, a potential addition, late addition to this 2018 football team, and we're going to jump right into that with Blair Angulo of 24/7 Sports to kick off our program. After that point, as we come to you 3 times a week now, we can kind of stay on top of the news a little bit better, so we can also cultivate the news a little bit better. And producer Kevin and I we're brainstorming on Tuesday, and we're talking about the Ohio State situation and kind of the state of college football. Alabama, which programs are threats to Alabama, and we came up with a question that's gotten a lot of responses on Twitter about the desired victory in the national championship game and who Alabama fans would rather beat. The explanations were fascinating. The discussion, we think, will be fascinating. So we'll kick off with Blair Angulo on a possible addition, get to those questions, and then wrap up this Wednesday edition of Crimson and Blue Chips. Now on YouTube, now on SoundCloud, coming at you via multiple platforms, and always powered by Bama Online. Let's go. Making his return to Crimson and Blue Chips, a guy who we really more than rely on the West Coast when it comes to Alabama recruiting, Blair Angulo, 247sports.com. Blair, you've really been at the forefront of this most recent development for Alabama. Brandon Kaho, a.k.a. Ale Kaho, that's what he's going to go by moving forward, former 5-star linebacker. A lot moving with his situation, a lot of, I guess, lack of clarity with where he stands. But first, let's kind of play the timeline game here. So he's a class of 2018, 5-star recruit, inside linebacker, signs a letter of intent with Washington. What happens after that?
Yeah, so he was early signee. So he signed during the early period last December, shortly after taking his official visit to Washington, had been committed to BYU for well over a year, takes that official visit to Washington, flips, then signs a couple weeks later. He was actually in Seattle, not on campus, but in Seattle, finishing up some coursework that he needed to take in order to join the team and to be able to participate in team drills and officially enroll at Washington. A couple family things happened. He had a couple deaths, a couple situations with the family. He had to go back to Reno, Nevada, and actually ask for his release from the University of Washington to kind of sort through everything. And now we're at the situation where he's looking for his next landing spot. Every source that I've spoken to from the beginning has been telling me that Alabama would be at the forefront of the race to land this former 5-star linebacker. Actually before he did flip to Washington from that long-time commitment to BYU, it had been Bama that was leading the charge there and had a big chance to pull him from his commitment. So I think this is just a case of a kid going back through the process and looking at the options that he was really considering. But that's where we stand now. He's been released from his letter of intent with Washington, never enrolled at Washington, never participated in any sort of team activity at Washington. So he technically is eligible to play from day one. So it's a unique and interesting situation for sure.
Yeah, so just for clarity purposes, Blair, so that means, let's just say he picks school X in the next 24 hours, 48 hours, whatever. He can begin play immediately. It's not a transfer. It's a traditional enrollment, correct?
Correct. Yeah, that's the case. Obviously, there are some roadblocks there because when he was up at Seattle, was not able to work out like a typical freshman would. He hasn't been able to continue building that strength or get into a college weight program or get bigger. Oftentimes after high school, we see recruits, add their mass, add a good 10, 15 pounds of muscle and really start to eat well and get integrated in a college program. So there is that roadblock that Ale will have to kind of overcome wherever his next destination is. But there are no restrictions in terms of how early or how quickly he would be able to get on the college football field.
Yeah, obviously this is fairly unusual, although fluidity's really become a part of the conversation when it comes to transfers or guys just changing their mind, let's say. Let's not use the word transfer in any light here. But kind of going back to high school and what made him a coveted guy, as you mentioned, committed to BYU at one point, flipped to Washington. Alabama was involved in high school, so this is not something new in terms of Alabama's pursuit of him. But what made him an Army All-American? What made Ale a five-star linebacker? Which, let's be honest, coming from Reno, Nevada, he's got to be the first five-star from Reno. Am I crazy there?
Yes, that is correct. And it's when you think of Nevada, you think of Las Vegas. You don't think of Northern Nevada, and he has really kind of taken that and put Reno on the map in a recruiting sense. And I think that was a big reason why he elected to go to Washington in the first place. It's a short flight away from Reno. He was going to be able to become a face of sorts for the area and kind of a success story. And now he can do it at another place. And, I think what made him so special at the high school level was just his ability to fill various spots along the linebacker group. He can play inside. He can play outside. He's tough. He's a physical tackler. He pursues the football with aggression. He's just so instinctual and so quick, and a guy that we thought the world of in terms of his upside and his athleticism. He was actually playing at the Polynesian Bowl for a couple practices with a bum shoulder. He had off-season shoulder surgery heading into Washington. He actually fractured a finger on his right hand, I believe, during a Polynesian Bowl practice, and then still stayed on the field for another 2 hours going through drills. I mean, the guy is tough. He's going to fit wherever he goes, and that's why we've seen, the likes of Alabama, the likes of Oregon and USC and BYU and a couple other schools start poking around once all this news came about, because this guy has all the upside in the world. He anticipates well. He sheds blocks. He has a background as a running back as well. So a very athletic, versatile prospect that would fit right in anywhere.
Yeah, again, for those who don't remember or need a reminder, Ale Kaho, 6'1", 218, coming out of high school, Army All-American, verified 4.68 40-yard dash, 35-inch vertical leap. So athlete certainly seems to fit there, Blair. And if you were on BamaOnline.com late Tuesday evening, you got an immediate scoop from Blair, which is obviously the advantage of being a premium member, a VIP member. But for those who may have missed it, how much is Alabama in this thing? You mentioned some of the other schools in the mix, Oregon, USC. Typically, when you're talking about West Coast kids and those guys get involved, there's, even for Bama fans, there's kind of a worry there, or at least, okay, this is a real situation. How much is Alabama involved, and what do we know about Kaho's timeline? How soon can this thing accelerate or maybe even come to a conclusion?
Yeah, I'll start there, and I think it's going to unravel here very quickly. A source has told me that within the next 24 to 48 hours, it could end up happening because he's already fallen behind a little bit. The fall camps are underway. He hasn't been able to participate in any team drills. He's going to be making up a lot of lost time, and I think that's part of the reason why he would want to jump into his next situation as quickly as possible, and that's why we've seen this unravel and develop as fast and as quickly as it has. People would wonder, if you're going to leave Washington and maybe be closer to home, you would pick a school on the West Coast. But I think it goes back to his experience last summer at Alabama. He went to camp as a committed prospect for BYU, landed an offer from Alabama, and I remember speaking to him during that trip, and he was actually hanging out with Tua Tagovailoa and Najee Harris and a couple other West Coast guys that had been out there to Bama and really got a feel for the culture there. I think he was very impressed with what Coach Tosh Lupoy brings to the table and obviously the development that Nick Saban really thrives on in that program. Even if you don't play right away, he knows that at Alabama you're going to continue to develop and your progression is going to continue in an upward way. I think he's always had that in the back of his mind. So as soon as the question started to arise about Washington, your mind goes straight to Bama, which during the recruiting process was going to be the school to flip him from that long-time commitment to BYU. So right now it sounds like Alabama, out of all the suitors, is probably the place he feels the most comfortable with, and probably the place he feels is going to get the best out of him, and that's why we see the Crimson Tide leading the charge.
Yeah, I remember actually, you probably were the one who told me this because of how plugged in you are with his camp and the camp in general on the West Coast. I believe in that camp, he worked inside and outside. I remember hearing stories on him doing pass rushing drills, but also coming back inside, which has become kind of the greater need for Alabama. They lost one to injury. There was a dismissal at the position. So physically and in terms of timing, it would be kind of welcomed, or obviously welcomed for Alabama. But we mentioned physically, Blair, that he may be a little behind the eight ball, at least just because he hasn't been in a Division I Power 5 weight program just yet. But what about mentally? And I know you said there were some family issues, things like that. But you did cite his urgency and need to kind of figure this thing out. So is this a guy who is capable of contributing during the 2018 season, or do you think it'll be naturally a little bit more of a learning curve because of all of the transition, both physically and otherwise?
Yeah, I think it's tough for a freshman to begin with to even have an impact or to want to make an impact, especially at a program like Alabama. And obviously he's at a disadvantage now if he were to go there with, having some time to make up and all that. But mentally, I think he's there. I think he wants to get to a place and just get to work. This is the number one inside linebacker in the 2018 class, according to 24/7 Sports. So he's a guy that has that work ethic, that mentality of wanting to be the top dog. He's not going to a smaller school. He's going to pick a school that's going to bring the best out of him, and you like to see that competitive fire. And I think it also helps with the new redshirt rule, right, where he wouldn't lose a year of eligibility if he were to play a couple of games during his freshman season. And I think that would be a realistic target for him. Get him on campus, get him acclimated, get him up to speed, build some strength. Again, down the road, especially at a position of need, like you mentioned at inside linebacker, get a guy in there that could help you, in necessary spots or on certain downs. That's a very realistic thing that I could see with him as well.
Lastly here, Blair, and again, this is Blair Angulo, 24/7 Sports, at B Angulo on Twitter, absolute ace in the hole for the network. And if you're following this Kaho news, nobody's even come close to his coverage, which is why he's on the podcast again. I know we've talked a lot about Kaho, but man, whenever we're talking Bama on the West Coast, especially at linebacker, edge rusher, whatever, Tosh Lupoy's name just naturally comes up. You didn't even let me get to the Tosh Lupoy question before you brought him up. With Kaho being released from his NLI, does that mean Lupoy is able to potentially communicate or communicate with his camp, anything like that, to potentially try and seal this deal, considering how well positioned Alabama was when this kid was in high school?
Yeah, so once the release happens, he's free to reach out to any of these coaches and start initiating some of that contact. And I would be completely stunned and floored if Alabama had not been in communication with him once the news dropped that Washington had indeed released him from the letter of intent. I mean, this is a no-brainer. Even if a kid isn't able to contribute from the start, you're going to be able to groom him and get him up to speed. And he's a no-doubt prospect. Like I mentioned earlier, he was a guy that was very, very high on Alabama's board. It was actually a kind of a tough loss for them to lose him to Washington in the fashion that they did, because they were, like I said, in a great position to flip him from BYU. He takes that last official visit to Washington before the early signing period, and the Huskies convince him kind of on the spot to shut down his recruitment. So, this is kind of a second life for Tosh and company out there. And I'd be completely shocked at this point, according to my sources, if he ended up anywhere other than Tuscaloosa.
So Tosh might have missed once, but perhaps on the
You
go
don't
around.
aim two curveballs to Tosh.
Yeah.
That second one, he's going to have it dialed in. So.
Yeah, you're such a baseball guy. And hey, the Dodgers, they did some good things, Blair. They did some good things. So we'll see. We'll see how this
they're turning it around. I think when we talked, that was the turning point. So you got to have me on the podcast a little bit more.
We'll do it. I don't think Bama's going to be done on the West Coast to cap 2018, and certainly not in 2019 with a bunch of big names out there. So we will certainly lean on you once again, my friend. I do appreciate you joining us, and expect another phone call and text message here soon.
Awesome. Thanks, John. Appreciate you, man.
We want to thank Blair Angulo, 24/7 Sports. Look, it's a late-breaking situation. It's something that we first heard about before we recorded Monday's CABC podcast, and it has already hit a couple of stages of development leading up to this point. So we certainly want to thank Blair Angulo for really hitting a home run, making it easy for us on the Brandon Ale Kaho, as he's going by, conversation. And this thing looks as fluid as possible, as positive as possible for Alabama, given the circumstances. Fairly unusual, but obviously anytime you could potentially land a 5-star, it is a big deal, and that's certainly how it should be looked at, especially at that position. I think that's what's so fascinating. We've talked so much about recruiting inside linebackers. We've talked about injuries, dismissals at inside linebackers. By the way, Vandarius Cowan is practicing already at West Virginia, if you're worried about that. So the NCAA is fluid right now. However, the Kaho situation, I thought this was the most important part. Not a transfer situation per Blair Angulo. This is like a traditional late enrollee. So think of a guy who maybe had some academic problems for whatever reason, and he's enrolling in August instead of May, June, or July. And obviously, when you're talking about 5-star pedigree, that is a welcomed conversation for Alabama, and then potentially USC and Oregon. So if Bama can pull it off, which it seems like they're in good position for, it could be an interesting situation. Maybe not now on the field, but once he does get acclimated to the program, once he does get his feet wet, if he is the 5-star athlete that we perceived him to be coming out of high school as an Army All-American, then maybe when the games get good, and we've talked on this pod a lot about the week schedule early on for Alabama. Obviously, Louisville, P5, strong foundation, NFL pipeline to some degree. I think everyone expects that to be competitive, at least for the majority of the game. But after that, there is a certain lull, and that's something that pundits will look down upon, but it's something Alabama needs to take advantage of, whether it's the battle at a certain position that we're not going to name today. We are quarterbackless on today's pod. So if you came here for this guy versus that guy at that position, you may want to change the channel. We are going away from that for the rest of today's program. We've had a lot of plenty of discussion on that front. But anyway, as you navigate other battles, other situations on your roster, you have a lot of time for maybe underdeveloped or guys who are a little bit behind, like Kaho in this case, who could potentially catch up towards the middle and even the end of the season. And I think that's where you could get plenty of value out of a guy like that, again, especially at a position like inside linebacker that we know does not have a ton of numbers, depth, experience, all of the above. So why couldn't an elite freshman come in and throw his hat in the ring, much like we saw to some degree with Dylan Moses 1 year ago. So excellent insight from Blair Angulo. That's why we bring you the best here at CABC. But before that became the backbone of today's program, producer Kev and I were brainstorming. We were show prepping as we do, before each and every program, and we were kind of wanting to tie current events into something organic and larger, wider scale. And obviously, there's a lot going on right now in college football. There's camps all over the place. Everybody's getting into it. Unfortunately, there's already injuries and stuff like that. And fortunately or otherwise, there's already some scandal, controversy, what have you, outside of the typical position battle. And obviously that leads to Ohio State, well, with all of its off-field situations going on, rallies, Papa John's, the whole thing. So we didn't really want to jump too deep into that conversation, one, because I think you guys are intelligent enough to be up to speed there, but also because we didn't really know how big of a topic Ohio State would be to Alabama fans. If it was Auburn, we would spend more time on it. If it was Georgia, we would spend more time on it, right? LSU, A&M, etc. So we said, you know what? Let's not be assuming in nature. Hey, I'm a journalist. I literally cannot be assuming in nature. So let's put it out there. And the way we wanted to do it, as you can see on the simulcast here, we took to Twitter and we asked a question that we expected to get some balanced responses on, and we were wrong. They were not balanced. We asked, who would you rather have Alabama play and defeat in a national championship? Ohio State took 61% of the votes. Does this stem back to Urban Meyer's days at Florida? Does this just look like revenge for 2014 when the Cardell Jones, Ezekiel Elliott-led Buckeyes defeated Alabama on their way to the college football playoff crown? We're not sure with all of the votes, and some more have even come in on Wednesday morning here as the poll remains open at CABC Pod on Twitter. But kind of a fascinating response. We expected more Clemson. Clemson was 6%. If I were an Alabama fan, I was in the Georgia camp. I would have thought that after last year and how I guess there was a perception that there was not flukiness, I don't want to say that, especially in the climate of this camp, but there was a perception of Georgia let it go more than Alabama went and got it in terms of that natty this past winter. So I thought that spurred into the recruiting battles with Kirby Smart and the storylines with Georgia in general, the fact that it looks like a collision course in Atlanta the next few years anyway. I thought, as a corny journalist, I guess, that Georgia would be the obvious pick. But again, we were wrong, and that's why we love doing this show, because you guys continue to surprise us. Excellent responses on this question in addition to the votes. I want to bring producer Kevin so we can be as transparent as possible with kind of how we went step by step in looking at this. I mean, man, Ohio State ran away with this thing, Kev, and I don't I can see why a little bit more now than when we first threw the poll out there. But I think it's still surprising. We just got a vote right now on the poll. So Ohio State just gained 1% on this poll. Kev, how do you feel about how it planned out or how it played out, and just kind of the general responses from our random poll that has become a big part of the show?
To be honest, I kind of wasn't that surprised, dating back to his days of Florida and everything. I think Alabama fans have a hatred of Urban Meyer, and what's going on in Columbus right now doesn't help that situation that much.
Sure.
But I definitely thought it would be a little closer. I thought we would get a little more others. To be honest, I kind of wanted to see who other people wanted to play, and we got some others. Of course, we got the UCF responses because, of course, they claimed the national championship last year for themselves, and I think some Bama fans want to shut that up. So
yeah, sell it on the field. They did beat Auburn though. They beat Auburn, and
They beat Auburn pretty convincingly in a bowl game. So.
By the transitive properties of simple-minded folks, national champs.
Beat Auburn.
Just saying.
National champion.
Just saying.
So, yeah, it definitely was more than I thought. 62% for Ohio State, which, if you do the math, came out to 38 Ohio State votes out of the 63 votes that we got. We got one in I didn't see. So yeah.
Interesting. Just interesting. And how about Clemson? 6%. I mean, so for me, corny journalist storyline 1 is Georgia for the obvious reasons, and some of those that I just illustrated. Corny journalist storyline number 2, obviously Clemson, because
you got to finish the series, right?
Right. We've had it the last 3 years, either in the semifinal or, of course, the national championship, and it's been a round robin. Bama won the first one, Clemson won the second one, Bama won the semifinal last year, and neither victory for either of the 3 games was truly widespread. I guess last year felt that way, but if you watch the game, it was pretty close most of the way until the defense, Raekwon Davis' spark, really created the separation. But before that point, fairly close. Neither offense looked great, and these are obviously 2 of the best defenses in the country. I mean, my goodness, those 2 D-lines, I mean, just sign them up for Sundays. But all those games were close. So corny journalism John, if that's a thing, would have said, hey, Clemson part 4 for another year in the playoff. Like, why not? But I think what gets me so excited about this poll weren't just the results and my, I guess, larger surprise than you, Kev, but the responses as to why. And I think that's where it gets so interesting, and that's why I love interacting with Alabama fans, because there was a strategy. So I think there was a lot of gut feel, and hey, I'm picking Ohio State, screw Urban Meyer. I hated that run at Florida until Bama beat them, and obviously they beat them the last time they played. I think that was the gut reaction for the most part, but the secondary reaction, the more thought out reaction, was I think more of an illustration of how Bama fans feel about Georgia. Like a couple of those responses here. Forgive me as I scroll here on the simulcast. A couple of those responses were just fascinating, and it was more about preventing Georgia from getting to a threshold that they may already be at. At Auburn 20 was in the Clemson camp. He said, Clemson, because those fans are getting cocky. I don't want UGA or OSU to even make it that far. LOL. That's where you see the strategy of the Alabama fan here, because first of all, you pick Clemson, natural storyline, whatever, but it's more about their fans getting cocky and even to a larger degree about Ohio State and Georgia not getting there. So you're not even wanting to defeat them in the largest game because it's a sign that they were able to match you up until that point. So again, the detailed responses from Bama fans. Zach Hubbard said OSU will be crippled for the next couple of years, so not them. He said Clemson or UGA are threats on the field and in recruiting, but I'd like to slow down Kirby while I can. An ideal situation any given year would be beating Clemson in the national championship game and Georgia going 8-4. Shout out to Mark Richt. But I love it. I love the depth there. Mike Hawk has a multi-layered response. 1, Ohio State for revenge. 2, don't even want Georgia or Clemson to make it that far, especially UGA because they seem to be the biggest long-term threat. So while I expected Georgia to win the poll based on storyline and based on recent relevance, you guys didn't want Georgia to win the poll because you don't want to make it seem like they can get that far, because I think everyone can agree that long term that is the true threat to Alabama. It's in conference. It's a Nick Saban disciple in a neighboring state. Really, the only team that could mess with you on the recruiting trail right now is Georgia. So I think I love the layers there with the responses from Alabama fans. Kev, I know we had the poll on Facebook as well. It wasn't as highly participated in, but what were the results there, just in terms of one school against the others?
We got 3 votes on the Facebook poll, so not as much participation, but we still got 3, and they all 3 were for Ohio State.
Yeah, so in a quick poll, short turnaround, unplanned, we got nearly 70 votes, and well over 40 came in for Ohio State. So you could see that. Again, Clemson. I don't see why. I guess people are tired of it. Maybe there's naturally, as humans, do you get tired of the same thing
Yeah.
over and over? But I mean, it's. I don't know. I feel like it's still up in the air. I wonder. I would. You know what I would like to do? I don't know. We don't have a Clemson podcast. We have a great Clemson site, Clemson 247. I would love to poll them on who they would like to play and beat in a national championship game. I don't know if Alabama would be a unanimous winner, but I would think Alabama would certainly take the majority of those votes. But we shall see. We shall see. Clemson plays, Auburn a bunch and stuff like that too. And look, we didn't get no clear Auburn votes. I know if we're talking about scenarios and we're talking about likelihood of it actually happening, obviously Georgia is tough because of it's in the same conference, and Auburn is tougher because you play them every year, late in the year, and obviously you're in the same division, much less conference. So I don't think Kevin, you can check on this. I don't think there's ever been 2 college football playoff teams from the same division, same conference, yes, but not same division, right? I mean, I'm not crazy there.
No, you're not.
Okay.
Yeah, there's been 2 conference, not the same division.
Right, and obviously the whole point. Some people thought of the BCS going away was to avoid Alabama Clemson or Alabama LSU situations, and obviously last year we got Alabama Georgia. We got 2 SEC teams again. So funny how that works, but I don't know. Just an interesting poll at CABC Pod. We're trying to be more interactive with you as we grow and spark some of that conversation as well, because we know you guys are so great at asking the questions and initiating the conversation. But during show prep, we just wanted to see, man, this Ohio State thing is so kind of crazy and I don't want to say unprecedented, but just kind of different, I guess. And to some people, it's not different; it's the same. If you go back to Urban's track record, we're not going to dig too much into that, but just wanted a way to spin it forward and bring it home for Alabama fans. But it's very clear. Not only do y'all want to beat Urban again, given that possibility, but you don't want Kirby to get there. So, Georgia fans, if you're a Georgia fan listening, welcome to the pod. But, man, they got to feel as close as they've ever felt to eliminating the gap between Alabama and Georgia. I don't think anybody would say that Georgia's pulled even with Alabama, but they've got to be right now as close as they've ever been in recruiting, in perception, and I don't want to say it to our listeners, but in fear. It seems like the fear factor of Kirby Smart is the most telling thing from this poll.
I don't know. I mean, there's been some pretty good Georgia teams on paper. So I mean, but those were the Mark Richt teams that never lived up to their hype. I mean, I think there was multiple years where UGA was ranked top 5 preseason.
Right.
But I think those. So I mean, on paper, there's been teams that have compared to Alabama, but they just never lived up to it.
Yeah, obviously
Georgia.
2012. That game was before this point. Really, it felt like the beginning of the end for Mark Richt because that was the closest Georgia would get to Alabama during the I guess beginning or middle of this Nick Saban run, and obviously that great SEC championship game went Alabama's way. Alabama won the national championship and has just won a few more since then. So that was I guess the closest on-field Georgia had been until 2nd and 26 when pre-snap Georgia had the lead, and it wouldn't last 10 seconds after that. So just interesting to see how you guys feel about these other programs. I was worried about only putting 3 schools on that poll, Ohio State, Clemson, Georgia, but those seem like the 3 best options. partially wanted to see if somebody just said Auburn just because, but we got UCF responses, as you said there, Kev. There was a Washington response, just, on the west side. Why not? And they played in the semifinals recently, but, hey, what about in the national championship? It would be telling. It would be kind of funny because of the whole Brandon Kaho situation, I guess. But it's just interesting to see those kind of responses, and we'll hope to do more things like this moving forward. Good kind of outside the box discussion here on CABC about the desired national championship victory opponents. But let's go to Q&A and kind of do what we normally do here on the podcast. We're going to start on Instagram, of all places. Again, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Gmail, we're everywhere. So if you got a question, throw it in there, and we'll hope to get it answered. This one's coming in from Dayton Chapman, who's been on here a couple of times. He's got a two-parter, very relevant to our guest, Blair Angulo, today. One, do you think Bama lands linebacker Brandon Kaho once he's released from Washington? Obviously, since you've asked this question, Dayton, he has been released from Washington. And look, last cycle, and longtime listeners will know, we penciled Brandon Kaho into the class a lot. We thought that he was going to be in the group. And as Blair detailed, the flip was to Washington, and it was kind of spur of the moment. Even guys like Blair, who tracked him so well and frankly better than anybody else, didn't really see that coming. So it was a good victory for Chris Peterson, and he signed in December, and it was all very quickly. And obviously, things have changed in a big way, but let's not forget that Bama was the expected school to flip him from BYU, much like it did with Cameron Latu, but it didn't happen. So Bama's been in this thing a long time. Tosh Lupoy's been in this thing a long time, and like Blair said, you can't leave two breaking balls up in the batter's box against Tosh Lupoy. He's going to hit one of them. So if Bama loses Brandon Kaho twice with Tosh, I think that would be fairly surprising. And I think the timing helps Bama. The need is certainly there for Alabama. He's got as much familiarity with Tuscaloosa, believe it or not, as USC or Oregon, even though those are West Coast schools, and he's a West Coast kid. So I do believe that Bama is a very strong favorite to land Brandon in the next couple of days, maybe by the end of the week. Blair said in the next couple of days we should hear something. So the sooner the better for him, obviously. He needs to get whichever school he's going to, he needs to go there now and get into fall camp because he's already behind with the mental stuff and certainly physically compared to some of his peers in the class of 2018. Second question in from Dayton, who is DCDAKT on Instagram. He says, by Bama adding walk-on quarterback Stone Hollenbach, do you think that helps Alabama's chances with teammate and 2020 wide receiver Julian Fleming? Julian Fleming is a very, very highly rated kid. And for those who didn't know, Hollenbach is a 2019 recruit who has elected to walk on at Alabama instead of some lower end offers. So technically Bama has 3 quarterbacks coming in this class. He's from Pennsylvania, Catawissa, Pennsylvania, Southern Columbia High School. He's the quarterback, class of 2019. Julian Fleming is a 5-star receiver, top 10 recruit, number 2 prospect in America on 24/7 Sports for the class of 2020. So it doesn't hurt that his quarterback, Fleming's quarterback, is Bama bound as far as we know. But 2 things here. One, package deals and those kind of natural connective deals, hey, they're teammates, whatever, doesn't always work out. Even quarterback, wide receiver doesn't always work out. So I wouldn't put a whole lot of stock in their relationship cultivating to going to the same school just because. Now, I never talked to Hollenbach, and I don't know Fleming, besides on paper. So anything is possible, but those things don't always carry over. And package deals in general, for that matter, I don't believe in, even when they do elect to go to the same school. Calvin Ridley and Sean Burgess-Becker were tied at the hip at every stage of their development, but after a year, Burgess-Becker left, and he went and won a national championship at UCF. So I'm kidding, obviously. It didn't go as planned, even when the package deal did involve signing and going to Alabama. A lot of those don't often work. So I don't put a ton of stock in that, especially when the kids are in different classes. I don't think that helps us enough or as much as needed, especially when you consider Fleming, put out a group of top schools recently, and Bama wasn't on it. Kid out of Pennsylvania, 5-star, coveted coast to coast. Bama wasn't on the list, but he told Hank South recently, and again, shout out to Hank and the crew at Bama Online. He told him, hey, I put out a group of top schools, but that's not it for me. So he seems to not be in a rush with his recruitment. And obviously, Alabama's Alabama. So he says it is a school that he's going to stay in with. And look, he's a Pennsylvania kid, and he's a wide receiver. So guess who's been recruiting him for quite some time, even before he got to Alabama? Of course, Josh Gaddis, the wide receivers coach and co-offensive coordinator at UA. So I think there is Alabama's, kind of ace in the hole, more so than his quarterback. Let's also remember, walk-on quarterbacks, preferred walk-on quarterbacks who make that declaration this early in the process, tough to kind of see it all the way through. There's a lot of time in between now and when a preferred walk-on would enroll, and there's no signing date. There's no documentation that makes it official before the kid arrives on campus. So even if he's a January guy, you've still got 4.5 months for other schools to watch him as a senior and eventually pull the trigger with a scholarship offer in the traditional sense. So there's no guarantee that Hollenbach will even end up at Alabama. So when you talk about that potentially helping with his receiver, I'm not always there. According to journalism, John is there for a lot of things, but in recruiting, not so much. I've seen too many of those situations go the other way. Sometimes they work out. JT Daniels, Amon-Ra St. Brown last year going to USC. But again, those were LA kids. USC was the favorite for each forever, independent of each other, and they just happened to be on the same team. So I think it goes both ways to some degree. But I'm not a fan or a guy who thinks that those package deals or teammate situations are going to work out for any school. We'll move on to Twitter now. Raphael Monroy using the hashtag. That's another way to get involved with us. Just hashtag CABC. Hope all is well. They said, do you think whoever wins the quarterback battle will decide the right tackle job? Lefty quarterback needs a stronger pass protector, presumably on the right side is what Raphael's saying. Who is better at pass blocking, Leatherwood or Womack? Roll Tide Roll from Long Island, New York. Raphael, consistency. We like that. This is a good question for me, but it's probably a better question for producer Kev. We'll bring him back in on here. So I think Raphael, Kev, is assuming, hey, Tua's won the job, but he's a lefty, so the blind side is now his right side. So how do you kind of look at it with the Womack and Alex Leatherwood battle that's going on pretty hot and heavy right now, by the way, at right tackle?
Yeah, I think that, like I said on a previous pod, I think that when you have a right-handed and a left-handed quarterback, but you also have a tackle that can swing and play right and left side, like Jonah can. I think Jonah might play left tackle if Jalen wins. He might play right tackle if Tua wins. But for this question, I think Womack's probably the better pass blocker. Leatherwood is more – and I think if Womack wins the job, a good move would be moving Leatherwood into guard. But for Raphael's question, I think definitely Womack's a better pass blocker. And then Leatherwood could move to guard if Womack wins that position. But I think the more realistic answer might be Jonah moving to right tackle and then having a left tackle battle.
Right, and that's assuming, like we said, that Tua wins this thing and it's like not even a split or whatever. And I don't want to talk about that, but that's like a permanent thing, not a round robin. So yeah, we wouldn't see Jonah move at that point.
No, you don't want to have your O-line switching on different series because you have a 2-quarterback system. If it's a 2-quarterback system, which it very well may be, you're going to have a set. I think you're going to have a set line. Jonah will stay at left, and then the winner of the Womack Leatherwood battle will stay at right, and then whoever wins that battle, the loser might kick into guard. Either way.
Yeah. Assuming it's even, let's say, hey, Leatherwood flashed enough in the Natty and has shown enough in practice, and Womack is now healthy, and heck, he started every game to some degree last year. If all things are even between those two guys, how do you play? You be Brent Key, who has an amazing problem on his hands this year with so much talent on the O line. How do you separate the two? If all things are even, is it just simply, hey, one of y'all kicks inside, or do you worry about other guys who might be excelling at guard? What about Jedrick Wills? What about Lester Cotton? What about these other guys? How do you, if all things are even between Womack and Leatherwood, specifically at right tackle, how do you settle that?
Yeah, that's definitely a great problem to have as an offensive line coach. Thinking about back to my days coaching at the lower level in college, like I couldn't imagine having to have a quality guy sitting on the bench, which could very well happen. They could have.
I think it will happen no matter what.
Yeah, I think there's going to definitely be an NFL offensive lineman sitting on Alabama's bench.
Crazy.
To start the season, which is insane to think about.
Like an NFL lineman with experience at Alabama sitting the bench.
Sitting on the bench, yeah, exactly. Yeah. I think so. Whoever wins that battle at right tackle, you're going to have to look at probably the right guard position, because I think Lester's going to solidify himself as the left guard from what I've been reading about from camp so far. So I think whoever wins that right tackle battle, whether it's Womack or whether it's Leatherwood, you're going to have to take the loser of that battle and compare them with the right guard and say, is either Leatherwood or Womack better than Wills or whoever is battling for that right guard position? So as an offensive line coach, you're going to want to put your best five on the field either way. So I think you take the loser of that battle, compare them to the right guard, and there's your starting line.
September 1, baby. Not that far away.
September 1, we'll find out who the front five are. But I definitely think there's going to be an NFL guy sitting on the bench.
Just an unbelievable issue, if you want to call it that, for Brent Key and the offensive staff there at Alabama. But as always, guys, I mean, hey, O-line questions, direct them to producer Kev. I'm gonna step my game up on my O-line stuff here moving forward. But let's be honest, Kev's gonna help me with that too. That's why he's a producer. We'll move on to our next couple of questions here on Twitter. Laquan chiming in at CABC Pod. Do you think Cameron Latu will be able to see the field at all this season? There's a lot of depth at outside linebacker, but I think it comes down to whether he is ready mentally, not to be stereotypical, but he seems to have that natural strength that so many Polynesians have. See, Laquan, look, if it seems that way and you're not trying to be stereotypical, you're good. You're good. We're not a big fan of stereotypes here. You got a Caribbean dude talking Alabama football every day, So, hey, stereotypes don't really work here, but yeah, if you excuse yourself, it is all good. But yeah, look, hey, if you talked about strength and size and defenders even to some degree, hey, that Polynesian culture is beginning to own the benefit of that doubt. So you also have to respect it to some degree in how you look at guys. But Latu, look, I agree with you. In seeing him physically in person, he plays a lot bigger than he was when I saw him. He was probably 225, 230 at the opening 2 summers ago, but he was mixing it up. He was like borderline getting into fights. He was getting under big blue chip offensive linemen and kind of pissing them off, which is good. But you also said, man, he needs to fill out some more, and then we'll see, right? We'll see on that evaluation. Well, as you're alluding to here, Laquan, he has added weight. He has hit the strength and conditioning program in stride. And I think physically he looks like a guy who is perhaps going to do a little bit more than a lot of us, and certainly me, expected him to do. So I think that alone is a victory for Latu the rest of this year. But there are a lot of guys, I should say, at outside linebacker. Obviously, if we're talking in a literal sense, which I'm a fan of, there was one guy ahead of Latu who we knew was well ahead of Latu who is no longer an option in Terrell Lewis. So literally he's one step closer in that regard. Hurdle number 2 for Latu, though, is even among the freshman pass rushers and even among the freshman outside linebackers, more buzz has been with Ayabi Anoma as a pure pass rusher. So if there's a guy who's going to play as a true freshman, I think Ayabi is a step ahead, but there may be 2 that have to play as true freshmen. We saw multiple guys last year, young in the linebacking room, inside and out, having to get on the field in some capacity. So who's to say Latu can't crack that at some point? And that's obviously not considering additional injuries. This time last year, we were talking about Terrell Lewis, Christian Miller, Anthony Jennings, and this bevy of depth Alabama had at outside linebacker. And then by the end of the Florida State game, all those guys were done. They were all out for a very long time. So who's to say something like that, or for Bama's sake, hopefully a smaller version of that doesn't happen early in this season. So if you're asking, do I think Cameron Latu will redshirt? I would think no. Well, maybe under the new redshirt rules, but I think he'll get into some kind of action more than I thought, more than most people thought at some point. Look, Nick Saban is not he's a starter, he's a bench guy, if that makes sense. He's a situational guy, and we've seen him use situational pass rushers all over the place at Alabama, whether it be linebackers coming down and rushing the passer like C.J. Mosley, Rashaan Evans, Ronaldo McClain, Reuben Foster, Dylan Moses even did it a little bit last year. I expect him to do that some more this year. We hadn't talked about that. But even pure pass rushers coming in for third downs. We saw Tim Williams create a niche early in his career doing that. I think Anoma, Latu, guys like that could easily be candidates for that this year, especially if, the attrition and the injuries do begin to pop in there for Alabama at that important position within the defense. So my point is, I think he's ahead of where we thought he would be. Mentally, obviously, every freshman, even the guys who we hear so many great things about, like Anoma, like Patrick Surtain, like Jalen Waddle, Jalen Armour-Davis, what have you, Josh Jobe, every one of those freshmen is going to get their butts whooped mentally. That is just a fact. The key is, can you get through those mistakes now and very early in the season to where mid-season and when the games get most critical, you're ready and you can be depended upon. That's the key for every freshman. And in a much smaller scale, when I was a freshman, that we played an option team, and I was much smaller than I am now, and I didn't play, and I was pretty mad about it. But I wasn't ready to adapt to that personnel as a corner. It was something that I hadn't shown enough of in practice and in camp and things like that. Played in every other game for the rest of my career. It started most of them, but that game was kind of like my wake-up call. Like, okay, mentally, I need to be there at all times. I was so focused on coverage, technique, leverage, my back pedal, my hips, all of those things. I wasn't worried about my run responsibilities and how quickly I was shooting my gun, as they say, to go make those plays. And when you're playing a triple option team, especially back in the day, which were more prevalent than now, shout out to Georgia Tech, you had to buy into that and show it that week. And I didn't know it at the time, but I didn't show it as much that week. And that was mental. It wasn't physical. I was a sure tackler. I actually had a lot of tackles in college, but I didn't buy in mentally that week of prep, so I didn't play on Saturday, and it really bothered me and kind of woke me up. So I just think mentally it's a difference. You can be there physically, and these freshmen, to a large degree, are there physically. You tell me Patrick Surtain can't play right now in the SEC physically? Of course he can. But mentally, can he catch up? Can he get through those mistakes and have his wake-up call preseason instead of during the season? And that same thing goes for Cameron Latu. We won't spend a ton more time on some of these questions. Luke Ferguson chiming in with a couple of here. He answered our Twitter poll. I didn't mention him earlier. He said, would love to beat Georgia 2 times in a row. So Luke is in my camp. I think Luke is like aggressive. Let's just go at him again. Why not? Why not beat him 2 years in a row? Maybe that would be the true way to begin to drop them down and eliminate that perceived status and stance of being right there with Alabama, burying them 2 years in a row. And I would assume, Luke, you and all the rest of the Alabama fans in the Galaxy would prefer a much more convincing regulation victory instead of a 30 for 30 worthy comeback and all of that. Another question coming in from Luke, or first question, the last one was a comment. If Bama gets Kaho, that has to mean it's Nakobe Dean or bust, right? Of course, Luke is referring to five-star inside backer Nakobe Dean, easily, for me, in looking at the rest of this class, the most important recruit on the board for Alabama. I think it holds true even if you do get Kaho, even if he is ready for this year, even if he does show five-star flashes like we would expect him to show, still Nakobe Dean is that important in the recruiting game. He's not a guy that comes around every year. His type of package, height, weight, speed, intelligence, pedigree. He's from a neighboring state. There's a lot of things in Bama's favor here with that position. And we all know that inside linebacker group is thin in experience. And if things go a certain way, there could be considerable attrition. Josh McMillan is close to exhausting his eligibility. Everybody knows the type of athletic talent Mac Wilson is. What if he has the great year that some people think he will have? He would presumably leave for the NFL. Dylan Moses will be going into his theoretical final season in 2019. So my point is, even with Kaho and some of the young guys on the roster, Markel Benton, Chris Allen, who I think is a guy who's moved around a little bit. We've seen Ben Davis move some a little bit as well. Chris Allen, I think, played a lot last year and will play a lot this year no matter where he lines up. Even with those guys, you need more. You need more depth. And if there's a guy who could have a Dylan Moses-like freshman campaign and come in there and compete, especially mentally, which has kind of been our focus here the last little bit, it is Nakobe Dean. Not to mention a five-star victory in the state of Mississippi. Nick Saban has never signed a five-star from Mississippi. Had Cam Akers committed for a very long time. Raekwon Davis was a top 100 guy, but not a five-star. He's never done that. He's never done that. And the top prospect in Mississippi, the sole five-star in Mississippi right now, is Nakobe Dean. So that would be another hurdle for Nick Saban to get over personally. And I think sometimes he just kind of likes to flex, and he hasn't been able to flex in that way. So Nakobe Dean certainly still the most important recruit in my opinion. But you definitely, numbers-wise now, Luke, that's where you could see the impact of Kaho. So right now we're talking about Shane Lee, verbally committed, thick, traditional, balanced inside linebacker. He's the only one on the commitment list right now. Do you pair him with one guy or two guys? That's what we're talking about right now. But if you bring in Kaho, he's effectively another recruit. He's another five-star, for goodness sakes. Do you now lower that number to maybe one guy? And if it is one guy, obviously Nakobe Dean begins that conversation. So in that regards, Luke, I think you can compensate there. I think you do just bring in Lee and a guy like Nakobe Dean in that inside linebacker group. Because, look, we haven't talked about this in a while. Numbers are getting tight. 20 commitments right now. 27, 28 is the number we're hearing for the final group in this class of 2019. And we know Bama's going to try to take at least two more offensive linemen. Maybe three. Maybe Bama hits a trifecta and gets Clay Webb, Darnell Wright, and Evan Neal. So that's three spots out of the available 8 gone. So there's 5 left. Well, we've already talked about inside linebacker. We could eliminate one of those spots right there. We know Bama wants multiple safeties in this class. It's got 1 or 2 committed now, depending on where you project DeMarco Hellams, but we know they're recruiting many more. So that's one spot. We know there's cornerbacks throughout the board that Alabama is still recruiting. So that would theoretically be another spot. That leaves 2 spots left. So we talk about a second running back being a priority. Trey Sanders, hello. Jarian Ely, Tyrion Davis. There's a lot of running back candidates out there. We assume Bama's going to take a second one. That leaves 1 spot left. Are you going to bring in another defensive tackle? You're tracking Ishmael Sopsher. You're tracking Fatu Tuitele. You're tracking Ika. You're tracking Leal. You're tracking a bunch of dudes. You got to bring in one of those guys. In theory, another interior guy. And as far as we know, without any decommitments or anything, that might be it with the spots. So if you're looking to compensate a position as an effect of landing Kaho, inside linebacker would make sense, but it doesn't mean Bama would be done at the position, and certainly it doesn't mean they would stop recruiting one Nakobe Dean. So, Luke, like where your head's at, you're definitely on the same track as me there. So that'll do it for today. That'll do it for Q&A. Fun show. I really enjoyed today. Producer Kev, awesome as always with the facts, with the answers, with the organization, because I'm not organized. Thank you to the fans for Twitter, our listeners, I should say. Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. You guys were all over it, and obviously Blair Angulo makes my job easy. Guys like that make my job really easy when we have to get on the phone on short notice on an important topic. And obviously, based on the questions we just answered, it's a pretty darn important topic with Brandon Kaho. So certainly stay on Blair's Twitter, B Angulo on Twitter, and BamaOnline.com for the up-to-the-moment situation with Brandon Kaho. And maybe by the time we post our show Friday, we'll have some news there. We shall see. Thanks for listening, everybody. We'll see you in 48 hours. God bless. Garcia out.
You've been listening to Crimson and Blue Chips with John Garcia Jr. Be sure to listen in again Friday. Until then, keep up with all the news on Twitter at CABCPOD.